very quickly, we bring thoughtful Christianity to campus. And a lot of people think that faith and reason are separate, right? You have to have a blind faith to be religious or to be a Christian. Your faith is grounded on nothing. But at Ratio Christi, we show the link between faith and reason, which we know is a part of not only reality, but it's a part of Scripture and God's Word as well. Where Jesus says, love the Lord your God with your heart.
We can do it afterwards, he said.
All right, maybe later.
So that's what Ratio Christi is on campus, and we look forward to serving the campus for many years to come. Eric is with us the third time, and he is a specialist in this topic. I keep turning to him for this area. He does so much more, and his book, which is on the table in the back, everybody that comes to the meeting tonight is going to get a copy of his book, signed by Eric. It's called The Lazy...
it's on there too, I guess.
The Lazy Approach to Evangelism, a simple guide for conversing with unbelievers. So it's great for someone who identifies as a Christian and who wants to understand how to have better, more productive spiritual conversations, right? At the same time, particularly in this age of, people seeing each other not as folks who can discuss, but as maybe enemies. That word has been thrown around a lot. This will help everyone with more gentle and evangelical-like conversations. So everyone's going to get a copy of this book tonight. So we're going to talk a little bit about Eric. He's a special guy. He does a lot of ministry both here in Texas as well as abroad. He just came from Utah, where he was working with GAP students and helping them understand more about their faith and their reasonable faith, but along in a context of the BYU and the LDS Church. So those of you that have seen Eric speak and debate, he's very dynamic and he's very rhetorically gifted. I love the talent that God has given him that. As I mentioned, he wrote the book Lazy Approach to Evangelism, which has been endorsed by all the biggies.
There's a bit of a longer story behind that, but let's just say I got a scholarship for cheerleading. I'll just leave it there. You do with that what you want. They said, we'll pay for your books and your tuition for 2 years if you throw girls in the air. And I said, let's do it. Why not? But suffice it to say that it was because of this, I didn't really take my classes too seriously in what I was going to do. And so I pick a class that I'm thinking, what class can I skip? So all that to say, so I'm looking at my classes electives, and I see philosophy, and I think, I want a class I could probably skip, and I don't have to do much work. And I saw philosophy, and I thought, that's making stuff up and sharing your opinion. I can do that in my sleep. First week of class, I learned a lot, but I remember my professor said something that really kind of shook me a little bit. Thank you so much. Yep. My youth pastor once said, if someone tells you to prove that God exists, you simply have to respond and say, prove to me God doesn't exist. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant. Put it in my back pocket in case I ever need it. First week of philosophy class, my professor says, he says, we're going to start by talking about the burden of proof. He explained what that was. You make the claim, you bear the burden. And then he said, as a random example, which I later found out wasn't a random example, he said, if you're a Christian here and you claim God does exist, then if someone asks you to prove it, you cannot respond by saying, prove to me he doesn't, because you're inappropriately shifting the burden of proof. And I thought, well, there goes my house of cards. But I was intrigued. I learned a lot, and he was very even-handed, even though I later found out he was an atheist. Second semester rolls around, and again, there's a lot more to the story, but suffice to say, I want to take another class in philosophy, and everyone warns me not to take Professor Pena's class, because not only is he antagonistic and condescending, his goal is going to be to make me lose my faith. And I thought, where can I sign up? I knew nothing of apologetics at the time, barely my second semester studying philosophy. I was just genuinely curious. And I thought to myself, if Christianity is true, I knew enough at least to know that I should know why, but I also understood that if it were false, I'd still like to know why, and maybe this is the guy for the job. So while there's lots to say about my time in this class, there was one time in particular, one class that stood out as quite literally the pivotal moment in my life in ministry. Walks into class, reaches into his pocket, and he pulls out this antidepressant pill. and he stares at it very dramatically for a few seconds. Then he begins his lecture. And he says, now religion wants us to believe in something like a soul, which is supposed to be immaterial. It is because of the soul we can have hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have gone before us. But the problem is, he said, according to religions like Christianity, you also have your thoughts, emotions, and sensations that are also immaterial, supposed to be contained in this alleged immaterial soul. But the problem is, if I were to take this antidepressant pill, which is physical, it has the power to affect the alleged immaterial states of my soul. But how could that be? How can something tiny and physical have the power to affect the immaterial? Because every time we look at, a scientist is going to look at brain scans, all they will find are neurons firing. And every time a scientist looks at the brain and body under a microscope, all they find are nothing more than the base elements of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And yet no scientist has ever found anything even remotely close to something like a soul. And how can that be? How do we explain this? And he said, I'll tell you how. The answer is really simple. He said, the answer is that there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. You are nothing more than a physical brain and body, a meat machine, and we need to learn to live with this fact, get on with our lives, and stop believing in these fanciful, foolish fairy tales. Class dismissed. Now, lots to say about this, but I remember sitting there and thinking, for the first time in my life, I heard an argument that if what he's saying is true, would prove Christianity false. And I'll briefly explain why. Because he had complained a lot about Christianity, but complaints don't make Christianity false. But if you look in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul essentially says this. There's a lot to unpack here, but he basically says if there is no resurrection, then our faith is vain, useless, imaginary, unfounded, devoid of value. And then he repeats himself for emphasis. If the dead are not raised, Christ has not been raised. Basically, the long story short is he says if there is no resurrection, then Christianity is false. And not only is it false, people should actually feel sorry for us for how dumb and gullible we were to believe this. And so I submit to you, according to Scripture, if there's no resurrection, no Christianity, I submit to you if there's no soul, then biblically speaking, there's no biblical resurrection, and thus Christianity can't be true. So we can sum it up by saying, again, no resurrection. Well, according to what Scripture says, that would equal no Christianity. Well, if there's no soul, by the same token, there can be no resurrection, and thus Christianity cannot be true. Now, before going deeper into this comes from a worldview known as naturalism. In my book, I call these strongholds. It's what 2 Corinthians 10, 4, and 5 says. Paul says we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. And then in this passage, he says that a purpose of spiritual warfare is to demolish and tear down strongholds. And you think, well, what's that? Well, he defines it in the very next verse, and he talks about false ideologies and beliefs. So naturalism would be a stronghold or worldview, which we could say there's various forms and facets of naturalism. For our purposes here, given what my professor said, it's the view that the physical material world is all that exists, nothing more, nothing less. Now, to go a layer deeper with naturalism, there's a few ways to identify this, and there are a few key isms that are associated with, if not inherent to naturalism. At least 3 isms associated with it. Empiricism, reductionism, and physicalism. And understanding each of these will kind of help you better understand this case that we're about to look into. So empiricism can essentially be defined as the idea that knowledge is attainable only through the senses. So in this view, only something like science, for example, scientism, is going to give us knowledge. And you know, in my professor's language, he talked about looking under a microscope, seeing, identifying, everything very empirically driven. And this leads to something known as reductionism, which is kind of essentially the naturalist attempt to explain any and everything by way of chemistry and physics. So you can spot this by listening to the language of nothing more than or nothing but type of language. Hence, my professor said that when we look at a microscope or a brain scan, we find nothing more than or nothing but physics and chemistry. And if you put these together, you're going to see that, well, under reductionism, I already mentioned, everything that exists is explained and reduced to something physical. So this leads to something known as physicalism. Now note, when you put these together, going back to reductionism, here's an analogy. If I said that marriage is nothing but signing a piece of paper for the government, then I have reduced the essence of marriage to nothing more than a legal document. Right? So this is reductionism. Physicalism is the view that human beings are purely physical objects. There's nothing immaterial about them. So a person is going to be composed of nothing but something physical. When you look at empiricism, you get reductionism. It tends to lead to physicalism. So we can all sum it up by saying, on the physicalist view, everything's natural, and thus there is nothing like a soul because only physical substances can exist. With this in mind, let's start now with some definitions. So, obviously, if we're going to make a case for the soul, we have to ask, what is the soul? I would say the soul, we can define it simply as an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. Immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. And to make a case for the soul, we're going to focus on these 2 points. Immaterial substance and the thing that possesses consciousness. I'd say that if you want to present a case for the soul, and by the way, a book I contributed to not long after my book came out, there was a Festschrift. It took me a while to learn that word. For Frank Turek, it was like essays in honor of Frank Turek. I thought you only did that when people died, but apparently if they're alive, they're called Festschrifts. And I contributed a chapter to it, and I called it, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be a Physicalist. Kind of a head nod to Turek there. And I say you basically need 2 points, 2 basic points. The first point is that consciousness is not physical. It is neither identical nor reducible to the physical. And the second point is that I am more than a brain and body. I am a soul. Now, you might think before we start and look into the case, some people may say, well, to answer these questions, we have to look to something like science, right? Because science is where we get our knowledge. Science is where we can come and find objective truth and reality. But I would say that science is virtually irrelevant when it comes to this question. And let me explain why briefly. Consider this thought experiment. Suppose you get a call from your neighbor, and he informs you that there's an invisible man in his house. And well, you being healthy, having a sense of healthy skepticism, you ask if you can come over to investigate for yourself. And then after a few hours, you come out and you're a bit upset with him and you claim that he's lying. And he says, well, why would you think that I'm lying? And he says, and your response is, well, because you claim that there's an invisible man in my house, and yet I looked everywhere. I looked in the attic, I looked in the closet, I looked in the bathroom, I even looked under the bed, and not once did I ever visibly see this invisible man. Well, of course, his response is going to be to pull out his hair and say, well, of course you didn't see him, he's invisible. Now, note, your neighbor's response doesn't prove there is an invisible man, but it does show that if you're going to object to this invisible man, you cannot appeal to your sense of sight, because not being able to see an invisible man is at least logically consistent with the claim that an invisible man exists. Does that make sense? Or you can put it this way. Science is a wonderful tool for studying the physical world, but it's a tool that is limited to only studying the physical world, whereas a soul, if it exists, is by definition a non-physical entity, which means you cannot use something like science, which is limited to the physical, to try and investigate the non-physical. This is what we call in philosophy a category fallacy. Or consider what the late atheist philosopher Michael Rouse said. He said, science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise it does not give certain answers. Put differently, trying to use science to try and investigate or answer the question of the soul would be like trying to use a ruler to measure my weight. Again, it's just the wrong tool for the assessment. So, what would be the right tool? Essentially, logic, reason, philosophy. To make this case, there's an important piece of philosophy that we need to kind of lay as a foundation. And if you want the really long phrase, it's Leibniz's law for the indiscernibility of identicals. But if you want the shorter answer, we can just call it the law of identity or Leibniz's law. And according to Leibniz's law, it basically says this. So we're going to apply Leibniz's law to our 2 points. And let's first break down Leibniz's law. And by the way, if you're here, you're a young single male, ladies go crazy over this stuff. So just tell them you learned about Leibniz. Yeah, those who are older are laughing because that's not really true. But you can tell them you learned about Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. But we do have some that are faithful young women of God who do go crazy over this stuff. So
that's how my husband got me. So.
That's right. Hey, smooth. All right, so Leibniz's law basically says this. If 2 things in question are the same, say some A and B, then it follows that whatever is true of one is going to be true of the other and vice versa. For example, Eric Hernandez and the guest speaker today. How many people am I talking about? One. My name's Eric Hernandez, if you know that. Right. So, right, one person. That means whatever's true of Eric Hernandez, true of the guest speaker, because they're the same person. This is Leibniz's law. But in principle, if I can find something true of one that is not true of the other, or vice versa, then it follows they cannot be the same thing. Now, in philosophy, when we use the word identical, we mean literally the same thing as. So we could say Eric Hernandez is identical to the guest speaker because I'm literally the same person. Now, with this in mind, let's consider a thought experiment to put this into practice. Suppose you walk into a lab and you see 2 bottles of clear fluid. And let's say they're each labeled. One is labeled water and the other is chemical X. But suppose that chemical X, the label was ineligible, it was ripped off, you didn't know what it was. Without picking up one instrument of science, so to speak, you're going to ask yourself, are they the same substance? So what you can do is you could apply Leibniz's law. And you can look and say, well, they're both clear, they're both fluid, they kind of feel about the same. And you conclude, well, maybe they're the same substance. Until you turn over chemical X, and you see on the back it says caution flammable. And you think, okay, well, I know that water's not flammable, which means, note, even if you don't know what chemical X is, at the very least you know what? That they're not the same thing. So this is essentially Leibniz's law. If you can find just one thing true of one that's not true of the other, they're not the same thing, even if you initially thought they were. Okay, now let's look at our 2 basic points and focus on the first. Consciousness is not physical. When it comes to consciousness, the mind, we can use those synonymously, there are essentially 5 states of consciousness. Now, I want you to think of it this way. Think of your soul as a substance, your mind as the states, and then these states have properties. Somewhat analogously, water is a substance and has how many states? 3 states. And if you can identify the property the water has, if I said, I have in my hand H2O and it has a property of being hard, what am I talking about? Ice, right. So if you can identify the property, you can identify the state and possibly even the substance. Consciousness comes in 5 states. So you have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will, or you can say volition. How do we know 5? Well, we can literally just apply what we just learned, Leibniz's law. I'll give you a quick example. Thoughts and beliefs. You might think, well, aren't those the same thing? Not necessarily. Here's why. I can have thoughts that I don't believe, and I can believe things that I'm not currently thinking. So given that there's a difference, we already know they're not the same kind of state. So consciousness comes in 5 states. Now, while there's more to say here, I want you to think back to what my professor said. He said, if the mind and brain are identical, then whatever's true of the mind would have to be true of the brain and vice versa. And I want to kind of pause here as a side note. In the book, I go much deeper into talking about, I have a section on the soul, but nothing really in depth like the chapter I have. You can go to my YouTube channel, I'll give it to you later, where I do debates and talks on the soul. But this naturalistic worldview has infiltrated even our thinking, and we haven't realized it. And I want to show you how really quick. So everybody do me a favor. Can you please point to what part of your body thinks? Can you do that for me? Brain, okay. Do you need a brain to think? Yeah. Does your brain think? Yeah. Let me switch gears here now. God the Father, does he have a brain? I didn't hear anything. I'm sorry. No. This is a Christian, not a Mormon group, right? It's a Christian group. Right? Just making sure. I just came back from Utah. I'm just making sure. Right. No, God the Father doesn't have a brain. But does he think? Yes. Oh, yeah. The thoughts, the Bible says his thoughts are more than the grains of sand. So he thinks without a brain. Are you made in his image?
Yes.
Yeah. Huh. So does your brain think? Right. So let me come clean and say that was a trick question. No part of your body thinks. And throughout the history of Christianity, there has always been this doctrine that you are an immaterial soul with an immaterial mind, made in the image of an immaterial God. Now, granted, while we are embodied, which is an important part of what we are, while we are embodied, sure, we use a brain to communicate with the rest of our physical body, but that's no different than saying a musician uses an instrument to play music. And we'll touch on that in a second. But my point here is to show that even though you think, well, naturalism, who cares? No one believes that. You can see how its influence, or at the very least, remnants of this mentality creeps in and we don't even realize it. And so we hold to really a cultural view that is saturated with naturalism that says your brain thinks, but then we wake up Sunday morning and worship a God that has no brain and thinks just fine, and we don't let these two beliefs come together because, quite frankly, we haven't learned how to take our theology that seriously. So, if what my professor said is true, though, whatever is true of the mind must be true of the brain because, according to physicalism, they should be identical because everything is physical. So again, whatever's true of the mind would have to be true of the brain. But given in Leibniz's law, if we can find just one thing true of one that's not true of the other, they cannot be the same thing. So let me show you how this can be put into practice. I was talking once with a non-believer when I was first studying the soul, I was at a Bibles and Beer event. I don't know if you've heard of those. It's a Christian organization that puts together apologetic events at bars. Actually, yeah, you guys were actually just at one last year. I did a debate with a friend of mine, Richard Suttles. And I was, kind of learning about this stuff, so I wanted to test it out. And I went up to a non-believer and I said, hey, you're an atheist, right? He said, yeah. I said, would you agree with me that if atheism is true, nothing non-physical should exist? Now, I want to ask this because not every atheist is going to necessarily be a naturalist. While I do think it's the most logically consistent view, not all of them will say only the physical exists. So I asked, and he said, yes, he agreed. I said, oh, okay, great. So then that would also mean, though, by default, that if something non-physical does exist, what would that imply?
Maybe you should be an atheist.
Well, then atheism can't be true, given what we've just agreed upon. So I said, so we can sum it up this way. If atheism is true, then consciousness, if it exists, is going to be identical or reducible to the physical, like the brain. However, if it is not identical or reducible to the physical, then that would follow that consciousness is not physical. And given what we agreed upon, if consciousness is not physical, then it would follow that atheism cannot be true. So the question becomes, is consciousness physical? Short answer, no. Long answer, no, with more O's at the end. Anybody? Yes, thank you. So, yeah, thank you. So let's look at this. I could spend the entire time just on consciousness, but I'm going to give you 3 examples, instances of how they're not the same, and we only need one to show they're not. But let's look at these. So, remember, there's 5 states of consciousness. Let's take just thoughts or beliefs. My thoughts and beliefs can be true or false. That makes sense to say. And granted, when I'm having a thought, there's neurological activity in my brain. But note that while my thoughts can be true or false, the neurons that fire my brain aren't true or false. It doesn't even make sense to say, well, these neurons over here are firing true, but these on this hemisphere, they're firing false, right? They just fire. There's no true or false to them. So they can't be the same thing. Or consider this. My brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds, but the thought I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. And while you may be having heavy thoughts throughout this session, we're not going to need to go buy a neck brace when we're done here. Yes, anybody? Thank you very much. I'm here all week. My brain can be in a state that is 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. It makes no sense to ask, how many inches long was that taste of that taco you just had? Right? They're just not the same thing. So, while much more can be said, we can say that if all the properties of the brain are physical and all the properties of the mind are not physical, then it follows, and I was talking to this atheist, I said it follows then that if consciousness, if it exists, cannot be physical, but if consciousness exists and cannot be physical, well then that would follow then if you consciously chose to become an atheist, then you shouldn't be an atheist because atheism can't be true, given what we've agreed upon. So the question is, are you conscious and did you consciously decide to become an atheist? If you do, give it up. If not, well, that's a whole other discussion, right? So, what about though, let's pause here. What about what my professor said, right? Because it is true that if I take this antidepressant pill or some kind of narcotic, it will indeed affect the immaterial states of my mind. And let's even make this harder. You could look at something like brain damage or even Alzheimer's, and it would definitely affect certain parts of my mental function, just like my memory or my thoughts. Well, the question is, though, does this suffice to show that the mind and brain are the same thing? And the short answer, no, and I'll tell you why. Because cause or dependence does not establish identity. Cause or dependence does not establish identity. So, suppose I'm a guitar player. I'm not, but let's suppose I am. And let's say I pop a string. And because of popping the string, I can no longer, let's say, play the music that I want to play. Does it follow that, therefore, I am a guitar? No, of course not, right? Or suppose I pop another string, and because of this, I'm no longer to even play a note like the note C. Well, does it follow that because of this, if I were to break open the guitar, give it a good shake, the note C would fall out? No, because the notes are not inside the instrument any more than your thoughts are inside your brain. In other words, note that although we can establish a cause and effect dependency relationship, right, we can establish that this over here, this musician is dependent on, or the music is caused by him, and there's a correlation between him and the guitar. No, it doesn't follow they're the same thing. And so in the same way, sure, I totally grant that you can give me brain damage, narcotics, hit me over the head, get me drunk, and it will indeed affect states of my mind, but it doesn't follow from this that the mind and brain are the same thing, because as I said earlier, cause or dependence does not establish identity. Make sense? Ironically, if anything, it shows that there's 2 things at play. If there's a cause and effect, we're not talking about one thing, we're talking about 2. So, Let's suppose, okay, we establish that consciousness is not physical. Now, the next step would be to ask the question, what is the thing that possesses consciousness? What is the thing that grounds consciousness? And there's at least one thing I know for sure, beyond any reasonable doubt, that is conscious. What is that? Me. I am conscious, right? I'll even go as far as to say, before I can even know God exists, I must know I exist, whether consciously or subconsciously. As Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, because essentially, if you doubt your existence, you have to first what? Exist, right? So if I'm doubting, I'm thinking, and if I'm thinking, well, I must exist. So to even doubt my existence, I have to exist. So I know I possess consciousness, but the question then becomes, what kind of thing am I? Now here's where we're going to go a little bit, one layer deeper, and I hold to a view known as substance dualism. There are various views of dualism. I would even say, in fact, I remember talking to John about this too one time. John would be like a hylomorphist, and I would say that that's also a form of dualism where you have something physical, something immaterial, right? We can just shorten it in that way. And I would define this as the view that I am a soul that has a brain and body. So I want you to note what I'm saying here. When I say I am a soul, I am literally saying I am identical, the same thing as a soul. In other words, I have a body, but I don't, quote, have a soul, because I am a soul, and in fact, a body without a soul is nothing more than a corpse. And I want to actually be honest with you guys. I've actually recently changed my view on this, because I have come to believe that we have souls, because a few years ago, I needed a new car, and I bought a Kia Soul, and I bought this car just so I can make this joke, like literally that is. So it's a very rich punchline, if you will. But when I was looking for it, I was soul searching. I got to milk it. That's literally the only reason I bought this car. A guy at a gas station one time was like, hey, how many miles does it get? I'm like, I don't know. What kind of engine is it? I'm not sure. He's like, well, why'd you get the car? I'm like, well, funny story. And I got to actually evangelize to the guy at the gas pump. So we can say this. So if I am a soul, and a soul is something that is immaterial, well, then it would follow that I am immaterial. And if I am immaterial, we can see that if the brain and body are something physical, we can automatically conclude, just based on this, that therefore I am not identical or reducible to a brain and body. So this brings us to our second point. I am more than a brain and body. I am a soul. Now with this in mind, once again, we apply Leibniz's law of identity, or Leibniz's law. Now to understand and grasp this, let's look at it this way. Suppose physicalism is true. Suppose I am identical to a brain and body. Well, in philosophy, I would be what you would call a mereological aggregate. Single guys, write this stuff down. I'm telling you, just go crazy over this. So what does that mean? A mereological aggregate is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So we'll just, for short, we'll call it an aggregate. And you see that things like watches, cars, or Lego bricks are what we would call aggregates, a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Now, I want you to notice something about aggregates right off the bat. Consider a tricycle. What you'll note is that for aggregates, their existence and identity is necessarily dependent on the structure and their parts. So, what makes a tricycle a tricycle?
3 wheels.
3 wheels. Note that if I remove one of these wheels, we can say in a real metaphysical sense, a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come into existence, right? Simply because we've removed a part. So now let's do a thought experiment with this in mind. I want you to take this car. I don't own this one. I own the Kia Soul. This one's a little bit out of my price range, but suppose we replace the tires on this car. Is it the same car?
Yes.
Okay. And for those that know some philosophy, ship of Theseus, basically. Have you seen WandaVision? Has anybody seen that? Trick question. It's not a Christian show, so shame on you. No, I'm just joking. They kind of go over this, which is really interesting to see philosophy in a Marvel movie. Okay, but let's suppose, though, that not only do we replace the tires, we replace every single nut and bolt, windshield, bumper, every single thing in the car, gave it a nice shine. Is it the same car? But before you answer that question, suppose we took those replaced parts and put them back together. Now you have 2 cars. And then my question becomes, which of these is the original, if any? Note, there's at least one thing we can agree upon. Whether or not there is an original, they both cannot be the original, right? And what this shows us is that when it comes to aggregates, they do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. So aggregates do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. With this in mind, we come to our first argument. I'm going to give you 3 arguments for the second point, I am more than a brain and body. First one is known as identity through change. So, for those philosophy nerds out there, this is going to be a disjunctive syllogism. It's a syllogism. Premise 1, I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. Premise 2, if I am a purely physical object, then I do not maintain or retain identity through change or part replacement. So, if we want to know which of these 2 we are, we're going to have to ask the question, do I maintain identity through change? Suppose this. Suppose I commit a crime 7 to 10 years ago. Now, we know that according to science, every 7 to 10 years, you change virtually every single cell in your body. So suppose I commit a crime 7 to 10 years ago. 7 to 10 years later, I get a knock on my door, and there's a detective. And he says, hey, Eric, we just found the evidence to convict you of this crime. Could I look at him and say, Jay, look, come on. You know that we're just purely physical objects, and we don't maintain identity through change. So, quite frankly, the guy you're actually looking for is a different set of properties and parts, so go find him, but good luck, he doesn't exist. And obviously, he's going to say, no, Eric, I'm sorry, we're going to have to take you in. Why? Well, because we do know that I do maintain identity through change and part replacement. And if that's the case, then it follows that therefore I am not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. Or consider an atheist philosopher, Jaegwon Kim. His is a bit simpler. He gave the argument, he said, in 2001, this brain and body did not exist, but I did exist in 2001, therefore I'm not reducible to this brain and body. Right? So that's the identity through change. Second argument is known as the indivisibility of personhood. Indivisibility of personhood. Same first premise. I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Premise 2. Purely physical objects can be divided and exist in various percentages or degrees. So now we're going to have to learn a little bit more philosophy, some terminology. And to understand this, we're going to have to make a distinction between degreed properties and non-degreed properties. So let's break this down. A degreed property is something like being soft or loud. These are properties that can be divided and they can exist in various percentages or degrees, right? They can go up or down. So something that's soft can be softer or harder, and something that is loud can be louder or quieter. So again, these can fluctuate. By contrast, a non-degreed property is a complete opposite. It's something that cannot be divided and cannot exist in percentages or degrees. These are what we would say they're all or nothing kind of things. All or nothing. So, to illustrate, consider the property of being even. Evenness. The number 2 and the number 6 are both even numbers, correct? But does it make sense to say that the number 6 is, quote, more even than the number 2? No. Why? Because evenness is an all or nothing kind of thing. It either is or it isn't. There's no in between to it. These are non-degreed properties. All right. Now let's look at personhood. You are a person. Is being a person a degreed property? Well, let's first apply this to physical objects. Consider a table. It makes sense, note, to say that you can cut a table in half, destroy one half, and we can legitimately say that we have 50% of a table. But note that if, God forbid, I were in a car accident and I was cut in half, let's say my limbs, not literally my body, but let's say I had 50% cut in half of my body, it would make sense to say that I have 50% of a body, but it wouldn't make sense to say that I am 50% of a person. Or consider it this way. Men are typically larger than women, right? We have more mass and matter. But does that mean that men are more quote-unquote persons than women? On top of that, if we attribute any kind of value to human persons, would we then have to say that men are more valuable than women? Well, no. Or think of someone saying, shaking their head, yes, they're going to be single by the end of the night. You should write these words down, by the way. If you think of it this way. Does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more? No, of course not. Why? Because we know that being a person is not a degreed property. And note the implications, which we can spend a lot more time on that. Think of abortion. Does it matter how big or small or whatever size that the unborn person is? No. Because if being a person is not a degreed property, it doesn't matter the size of mass and matter that you have. Now, some physicalists may say, well, it's not about the body, it's actually about the brain. If you were to lose parts of your brain, that is what contains your personhood. But if you look at these three pictures, these are instances of what's called Dandy-Walker syndrome or anencephalic disease. And there are some operations where you can actually remove parts of the person's brain. But note, let's say you remove 30% of a person's brain. Does it follow that therefore they are only 70% persons? No, of course not. Now, they may lose functioning, but functionhood doesn't establish your personhood. So while I may lose functioning, I don't lose personhood. So, going back to the argument, it follows that I cannot be divided or exist in percentages or degrees because I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. And note, my body can be divided and exist in percentages, but I cannot. Well, if that's the case, then it follows that therefore I am not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. All right, one more argument, and then we can jump into questions. This argument is the argument from free will. I know there are different theological views on free will, so if you don't like this one, you can just set this one aside and use the other two. So let's start with this. What is free will? So I am what you call a libertarian when it comes to free will. And I would define free will as being the original source or first mover of your will or actions. Put differently, basically you're not caused to act or will by something prior or external to yourself. So let's wrap our minds around this concept. Suppose there is a murder scene, and you know that this murder was literally caused by a bullet penetrating the person's heart. I want you to note this. We know that the direct cause of the death was a bullet penetrating the heart. But do we blame the bullet? No. Why? Because we know that the bullet didn't act on its own, but was caused to fire by something prior. So we can go one step back and look at the gun. Do we blame the gun? It depends who you vote for, I guess. But no, we generally should not blame the gun, right? Because why? We know the gun did not act on its own, but was caused to act. So we go one more step back and we find a person. Now, do we blame the person? Absolutely. Now, note what we just did here. The bullet and gun are what we would call secondary causes, and we assume that the person here is the primary first cause that caused the gun to fire, that caused the bullet to shoot, that penetrated the heart and caused the death. So note, when it comes to praise or blame, we're going to look for the first cause or first mover in this chain of events. All right, with this in mind, same first premise, I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. 2, if I am a purely physical object, then I do not possess free will. I would be nothing more than the gun or bullet. I would be a secondary cause. To wrap our minds a little bit deeper with this, consider an illustration Aristotle used. He said, suppose I move a rock with my staff. We can explain in this chain of events that my staff moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, but then the question becomes, what moved me? Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that there is no God, there is no soul. And let's say atheism is true. If that's the case, then something known as the law of causal closure would be true. What does that mean? It's essentially the view that every physical thing must have a prior physical cause. In other words, no God or souls are allowed or involved in this process. We cannot use anything immaterial to explain these things. All right. So we're assuming this paradigm, atheism is true, physicalism is true, no God, no soul. Well, if we're going to explain Aristotle's question, what moved me? Well, the physicalist could say, well, a neuron firing or a group of neurons firing is what we can use to explain the hand that moved the staff that moved the rock. And note, because neurons firing are inside me, note that I could be the first cause, and if that's what it takes to have free will, well then boom, I have free will and no soul is needed. But we have to call a timeout. There's a flag on the field. Why is that? Well, I want you to note what they just did. What is this? What kind of event is this? Physical event. It's a physical event. And according to the law of causal closure, which is going to be true if there is no God, no soul, then every physical event must have a physical cause. So now what has to happen is we have to go back to this brain firing, and if there's no soul, then we have to ask what caused this brain firing to fire, because according to this view, it must be explained by a prior physical event. So we have two options at this point, for the physicalist rather. Option one is you can say, okay, well, a prior brain group of brain firings caused that first brain firing group to fire. Okay, but Again, what's the problem? Well, you can't say we have free will because, wait a minute, this is still a physical event. So they can just say it again. Well, a prior group of neurons firing caused the other one. Same problem, but then a prior, and then a prior. And I want you to note what begins to happen here is that you lead into this like infinite regress of prior causes, and then everything just kind of, ooh, man. And then it breaks your computer. But no, in all seriousness, you see that this simply cannot be done. In other words, option one is simply not possible because note, if we want to explain the rock by the staff, by the hand, and then by the hand a brain firing, note that what's going to have to happen is in order to explain this, if you're going to posit an infinite regress, that would actually make it impossible to even explain the rock moving because infinite regresses are just logically impossible. So option one can't happen. Now we look to option two. And option two is simply this. No matter how many group of neurons you want to posit, at some point you're going to have to say, and something prior to this, beyond myself and prior to myself, whatever that may be, cause the brain firings to fire, that cause the hand to move, cause the staff, cause a rock. But if this is the only route they have, which really I would say this is the only option, you're no longer the first cause, and if you're no longer the first cause, you cannot have free will. So, back to the argument. I'm either a purely physical object, aggregate, or an immaterial soul. If I am a purely physical object, then I do not possess free will. So we could say no soul, no free will. However, if I do possess free will, well then the opposite is true, therefore the soul exists. Hence, I'm not a purely physical object. 5, I am a soul. Now at this point, you might have an objection. And an atheist may step in and say, well, wait a minute, time out. I don't believe we have free will. And if this is your case for the soul, well then I reject the premise that I do possess free will. I want you to pause and think about this for a second. What I often hear from non-believers, they'll say things like this, that I'm a rational free thinker, right? I am not brainwashed by the shackles of religion. I am free to think for myself. Some go as far as to say some people are stupid, some are religious. I can't really tell the difference, right? Because they have this, what we can call rational responsibility. I think for myself. I don't have to believe some outdated, ancient, homophobic, fill-in-the-blank book. I am a rational free thinker. I have rational responsibility for my thoughts. Simultaneously, a lot of non-believers will say, on top of that, I don't need God for morality. I don't need to believe in God. I don't need religion. In fact, I just have a conscience. I don't need religion. And really, imagine a world without religion. Because you see, science can fly you to the moon, but it takes something as wicked as religion to fly you into buildings. And what kind of a God, immoral God, would just send you to hell just because you don't want to follow and worship him? Let's call this moral responsibility. Now, can they possess either of those two if they deny free will? Well, let's look at this. Remember this illustration that we just looked at. And I want you to note this. We've already established that in this situation, we have a first cause, secondary causes, murder, and we blame the first cause, or this person, because we assume they're the first cause. But we've established under physicalism, given atheism and the law of causal closure, something prior to this person has to be the one to cause all this chain of events to cause a murder. And what ends up happening is you're no longer the first cause, but instead you now become, just like the gunner bullet, a secondary cause. And if this is the case, here's the irony. If the person wants to claim rational responsibility or moral responsibility, then they're implicitly assuming they have free will. And if you have free will, as we have established, that would require soul. However, if you deny the soul, you're going to have to deny free will. And if you deny free will, you're going to have to give up rational responsibility and moral responsibility. I was at a friend's Christmas party once. It was a friend's company Christmas party. And as I was kind of, getting to know some of her other friends, this one guy came up to me and, he asked what I did. This was years ago, even before I was married. And we met each other at a school I taught at. I taught at a Bible Institute. And I told him, and he said, oh, I used to be a Christian. And then, I kind of grew out of that and I learned this and this. I said, oh, really? I said, why is that? And he basically gave me two reasons. He said, one, he realized we didn't have free will to believe in God to begin with. You're whatever you're born into, however you're raised, that's what decides what you believe. And on the other hand, he said, and plus religion is very oppressive. It oppresses women's rights. It forces people or keeps people from marrying who they love, basically same-sex marriage and abortion. And I said, interesting. And I said, and so after studying this, what did you conclude? He said, well, after knowing all these things, I realized the most logical conclusion is to be an atheist. I said, interesting. I said, do you mind if I ask you some questions? He said, sure. And actually, he said, sure, most Christians get mad at me at this point. I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. This is my lazy approach. I said, let me ask you this. So one of your factors was that there's no free will, right? He said, right. I said, well, if that's the case, you also claimed that another factor was this religious oppression, right, on society. He said, right. I said, well, take something like the Twin Towers. How can you hold these people morally responsible for what they're doing if, on your view, they didn't have the freedom to do anything else? How can they be morally responsible if there is no free will? And his eyebrows shut up, like he never thought about that before. And he goes, I don't know. I said, well, that's fine. I said, just chew on that. Here's my next question, if that's okay. He said, sure. I said, if there is no free will, aside from moral responsibility, I said, then you seem to, because what he was saying, you told me that you studied, spent a lot of hours looking into this, rigorous research, lots of looking into these things intellectually, logically, philosophically, and your most rational conclusion was to be an atheist. However, if there is no free will, then you really didn't have a sense of intellectual integrity or rational responsibility to believe what you do, because your beliefs are no more rational than the religious nut yelling that everyone's going to hell, because you are both determined to believe what you do. So I guess my question is, did you freely choose to become an atheist or freely come to believe that there is no free will? And he said, I'm not sure. I said, well, yeah, just something to chew on, something to think about, just kind of left it at that. Because his very two objections were against God, but ironically, without God and without a soul, without something immaterial, you can't have the very two things he's trying to uphold. So we can put it this way, given our argument, purely physical object, immaterial soul. If I'm a purely physical object, I do not possess free will. Well, again, if the person wants to claim rational responsibility and moral responsibility, then it follows, I do possess free will, therefore I'm not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. I touch on not everything in here, but some of this in the book, and then again, you can go to my YouTube channel or get that Feshrift, I think it's called Faith Examined with Turk. Also keep in your prayers. I am in the process, I don't know if you think well, he runs a YouTube channel, teaches at Biola. His name is Ryan Pauly. Also in charge of Maven. You know Ryan?
I think we were at biology.
Yeah, probably actually, yeah. And so someone reached out to him about writing a book on AI, and he recommended writing a chapter on AI and the soul. So him and I are co-authoring that. And when I say co-author, I'm writing about 90% of it, and he's writing the other. But he wanted, really what it was is, he's like, hey, I think you do good in this area. You can use like my credentials, we can co-author this chapter. So I thought that was pretty cool. So lots more to say. Again, you can go there. Let's recap before we take questions really quick. The importance, we didn't touch on this, but the Bible says love God with your mind. 2, we know that if there's no soul, as I argue, there's no resurrection, and thus Christianity is false. Early on when I got into apologetics, I remember I was talking to some youth pastor, and I was sharing about this. I can't forget what they said. And I was telling them about my experience with this professor and my questions I had. And this person said, oh, well, my youth don't have those kind of questions. And I'm like, well, I don't want to, we're recording, so I won't curse here or anything like that. But I said, oh, so forget me, I guess. And I said this, I said, I had those kind of questions. And I felt like saying, and I'm glad I didn't have a youth pastor like you. But on top of that, I said, can I be honest with you? Your youth probably do have these kind of questions. It's not a matter of whether they do, it's whether or not they trust you with these questions. And so if they have these questions and they're not asking you these questions, they're asking someone else. So, existence of the soul, we define it as an immaterial substance that contains or possesses consciousness and animates the body. And we focus on 2 basic points. These 2 basic points were 1, consciousness is not identical or reducible to the physical. 2, I am more than a brain and body, I am a soul. And to use this, what we saw within consciousness, or the mind, has 5 states: thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and volition, acts of will. To explain all this, we use Leibniz's law of identity, or the law of identity. We saw that if there is no soul, then the mind is identical to the brain, and whatever's true of one is true of the other. But if we can find something true of one, not true of the other, they're not the same thing. And we saw that cause or dependence does not establish identity. Then we looked at, I did that backwards. Then we looked at part 2. I am, the second point, I'm more than a brain and body, I'm a soul. and we use 3 arguments: identity through change. If I'm purely physical, I don't maintain identity through change. 2, indivisibility of personhood. My body can be divided in percentages or degrees. I cannot. And 3, free will. We saw that in order for someone to affirm rational responsibility or moral responsibility, then without free will, you cannot affirm these. If you do affirm these, then there is free will. And if there is free will, there is a soul. Questions, comments, contentions, or clarifications?
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
You've got plenty of time for questions or comments.
Yes.
Are you familiar with what Michael Egnor is doing? He's the neurosurgeon that has the Immaterial Self book.
Mm-mm.
That came out, The Immortals.
Mortal Mind, there you go.
Immortal.
Oh, no.
Yes, you need to read that.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So it's a recently released book, and he's going to be at the Science and Faith Conference coming up in February.
Oh, yeah. I think I saw something like
He'll
that.
be here in town.
I've read Mario Beauregard's book, The Immaterial Mind. Is that what I think is what he calls it? But he's a neuroscientist that also wrote something on the soul. Really good. Similar. Yes.
So I'm just curious, so do you not ascribe to hylomorphism?
I do not.
So I would have to ask, are you human?
Yes.
So is a soul human, or is a human a soul plus a body? Because
Hmm.
without a body, that would just be a ghost or a spirit.
Could be, yeah. So I would say that the soul is the human person, and the soul is even gendered. It goes as far as to say. So I hold to what's called a Traducian view of the soul, that my body is an extension of my soul. So the formation of my body is in part because of the nature of my soul. And I think it's very similar to hylomorphism. So for those, you want to explain hylomorphism for those?
So hylomorphism is, well, John's more of the expert on that, but that's just the unity of
Mm-hmm.
the body, the body and the mind. Because wouldn't we say that, like, if we were to have humanity without the body, what's the point of having the resurrection?
Hmm.
Because I think we cease, if we have a body without a soul, it ceases to be a person. And if we have a soul without a body, it ceases to be a human. But if we say, I am a human, or if someone punches my arm, I'm not going to say, why did you punch my body? I'm going to say, why did you punch me?
Yeah. And so, yeah, no, great questions. I would say that I'm still a human person without a body. And this is where I would probably disagree with the hylomorphist. But because I think my body is a reflection of the nature of my soul. So my body is a reflection of what my soul is. So if I have male body parts, that's because I have a male soul. So what I appreciate about the hylomorphist view is the deep integration with the body and soul. And I say yes and amen. I think the main difference would be I think I can exist as myself without a body. I point to the intermediate state. Actually, I've had 2 discussions with hylomorphists, which are really good. They're on my YouTube, well, I think they're really good, right? On my YouTube channel. But yeah, some of the concerns are, well, what, and that's actually a really good objection. Well, if you punch my arm, are you going to say you punch my body or you punch me? Moreland would argue, and I think I lean this way, I would technically have to say you punched my body, but I would say that the body's an extension of me, so I could say more loosely that you punched me. But yeah, when I look at the intermediate state, I would say we exist without bodies, and yet we're still the same person we were prior to death. And then at the resurrection, we're continuing the identity to change. So I like to put it this way, which I got from Moreland. I am most naturally embodied, but not essentially embodied. So it is natural to my nature to be embodied, but it doesn't follow that I lose my essence when I lose my body in the intermediate state.
How do you get around Gnosticism with that?
Yeah, by not being a Gnostic is what I usually tell people. So the Gnostics, it's tongue-in-cheek, right? But so the Gnostics thought that the body or anything physical was evil, right? So as long as I don't go that far, I think I'm good. I'm not saying the body's evil. I think we should be embodied. I think it's natural to be embodied. And I think God created us to be embodied. And what's interesting, John Cooper, not the musician, the theologian, John Cooper has a book called Body and Soul, Life Everlasting. He argues that the intermediate state is likely a byproduct of the fall. So had there been no fall, there would be... Everybody know what the intermediate state is?
Sounds like purgatory.
Okay, so Paul says to be absent from the body. Very nice. So if we were to die right now prior to the final resurrection, we would exist temporarily disembodied. And Paul does not want to go through that. And without going there, so there will be a time where temporarily, if we die prior to the final resurrection, we will exist temporarily without a body. That's called the intermediate state or the state of disembodiment. At the resurrection, we get our bodies. So Cooper argues that the intermediate state is likely a byproduct of the fall, and had there been no fall, there'd be no intermediate state. But given that there is an intermediate state, I think it points to in my opinion at least, helps answer that question of whether hylomorphism or like a different type of substance dualism. So while I appreciate and align a lot with hylomorphism, that intermediate state is where I can't get past it when it comes to hylomorphism. I know, to be fair to hylomorphists, they'll say, well, we're not fully human, something to that effect. That would get into a deeper discussion of the metaphysics of the nature of the soul, and I would just say that my body is a byproduct of my soul.
So essentially you're saying if you put too much like of yourself into your body, then you end up ceasing to be you once you leave your body. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say it that way. I don't know what you mean by putting too much of myself. So I would say there's a very deep, intimate integration with the soul and body. And this is what I appreciate about hylomorphous views. So on my view, this is not a perfect analogy, but I am omnipresent to my body like God is omnipresent to the universe. Which means when I do this and then wiggle my toe, I don't have to travel there. I am fully immersed throughout my body. So I'm not a Cartesian dualist where for Descartes, it's like this loose external connection. For me, it's inside out. For me, so when people ask me about, let's say, abortion, well, when does life begin or when does the soul enter the body? On my view, that's actually a category fallacy question. On my view, if there's a body, there's a soul, because a soul is what forms a body, which a hylomorphist would agree with there. So to get a little bit the technical terminology, my soul is ontologically prior to the body. The whole is prior to the parts. I can go a little bit to explain that. If I take a,
More creationist than traditionist.
it's so the traducianism comes in because it's my soul that forms my body and produces my body. Whereas on the creationist view, I'm going to loosely. So we're asking about traducian and creationist view. On a traducian view, in part, I'm going to simplify this. My soul is a byproduct of my parent soul, in some sense. On a creationist view, again, I'm oversimplifying. A body exists and God zaps or puts a soul into that body. So I would say on a creationist view, the body can exist without the soul, and then God puts it in there. It could be simultaneously, but ontologically speaking, the body and soul don't necessarily have to exist at the same time. On my view, you have to have a soul, I say ontologically because we're not talking chronologically. Everybody understand that?
Yeah.
So the soul has to exist ontologically prior to the body. So if I take a tire off a car, it's still a tire and it still exists. What that shows us is that for aggregates, the parts can exist independent and separate from the wholes, right? So for aggregates, the whole depends on the parts. For a substance, which is what we are, the parts depend on the whole. This is why you can have a dog born without fully functioning eyes or ears, because it's a whole prior to the parts. Aristotle said if you chop off my hand, it will lose its identity as a human hand, which is evident by the fact that it will decay and cease to exist in a few days. So for substances, which is what we are, the parts depend on the whole. For aggregates, the whole depends on the parts. So on the traducian view, that lines up perfectly, if you were, or it flows consistently with that. And then again, my body, to use a fancy way Moreland puts it, J.P. Moreland, by the way, he says the soul is metaphysically complex, but ontologically, sorry, it's been a long day. Metaphysically complex, but mereologically simple. So I believe I am a simple substance. I don't have separable parts. I'm not an aggregate, basically.
And that's kind of what I was misunderstanding earlier, because if you essentially have the components of an aggregate with your soul and your body, then removing your soul from your body would be like, well, which one is you? Kind of like the car.
Okay, yeah.
But you escape that problem by saying that they're like kind of dependent.
I wouldn't say dependent. I would say, so the body's a mode of my soul. So here's another layer deeper, since we're going this deep. And this is awesome. Technically, on the view that I hold to, which is J.P. Moreland's view, it's technically not substance dualism because the body is not a substance in itself. And that's another place where the hylomorphists would agree with me, where it's more of a unity. And I agree with that. I just think I can exist disembodied without my body and still be me. But yeah, so on my view, there's one substance, me, the soul, and then there's a physical aspect to that. But my body is not an aggregate. It's an extension or a mode of my soul, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, I just kind of was wondering, what do you mean by the soul form the body?
Very good. So are y'all familiar with the language of a priori and a posteriori?
Maybe a little bit, like about how God and Jesus have the positional like relation of Father and Son, but not the the like chromatic. Or
Not inherent to God or Jesus. And philosophers like to use Latin for whatever reason. So, yeah. So, and here's why this is relevant. I promise I'm not just trying to impress you with big words or anything like that. So, a priori is a conclusion we can come to without leaving the room. So, if I ask you, how many points does a triangle have? We don't have to leave the room. It's a posteriori. No, that's a priori. Sorry, a priori. A posteriori, the way I like to remember it, is if I want to know whether or not it's sunny, I have to get off my posterior and go investigate, right? So a priori, prior to investigation. A posteriori, get off my posterior and go investigate. There are everything we just talked about, I dare say we could argue these things without leaving this room, right? I don't have to show you slides of anything physical. However, there are some things we have discovered in a posteriori way about the soul. Here's some things I would point out. If my body is a reflection of my soul, if my body is a reflection of my soul, I like to think of it this way. Suppose I took a chair and I put a blanket on top of it. You can't see the chair, but you can look at the shape the blanket takes. And by looking at the shape of the blanket, it gives you an idea of what's underneath the blanket. Same thing with the body and soul. If I look at my body and I find, I can associate this part of the brain with language, then it must follow that it is within the nature of my soul to have language. But then suppose I do an autopsy on a dog body, and I say, it's missing that part of the brain associated with language, and I can conclude or infer that therefore the dog doesn't have this capacity for language. Otherwise, the soul of the dog would have developed a brain with that part of the brain that's associated with language. So I can actually look at the body and discover things about the soul because the body is an extension, a byproduct, an outworking of the soul. Moreland says the body is an external realization of an internal structure. So my soul has a blueprint for my body, and it creates a body that it needs to utilize the capacities that it has. So here's something that might throw you for a loop. Your eyes don't see, you see. If I take your eyes out, you're blind, sure, but if I gave you other eyes, you could see. Why? Because it's not your eyes that see. Your soul, the nature of your soul has a capacity for sight and thus needs a physical body to utilize those capacities while embodied. Yeah. Good question. Does that help?
Well,
Feel free to ask more.
I have a follow-up question to that, actually.
Okay.
Because I've heard a lot of people talk about, like, abilities that we'll have on the new earth. Or whatever.
Yeah.
but like, do you think that it's just kind of like parts of the blankets that are covering that, or do you think that like what we have is what we'll have?
Yeah, great question. Okay.
Yeah.
So I would say, okay, let's think of it this way. There is one human nature. So anything I see you do, in principle, I can do. But now we get into a hierarchy of capacities. What's a capacity? It's a type of ability, but there are a hierarchy of these. So, for example, I have the first order capacity to speak English. I'm doing it right now. And I have the second order capacity to speak French. I don't know how to speak French. So to develop that, so I have the ultimate capacity to speak French, but it's not actualized. It's not a first order capacity. So in order to develop this ultimate capacity, I have to engage in the capacities I have to, quote unquote, unlock the latent capacities that are within my nature, but I don't currently possess. Does that make sense? Yeah. That being said, if I see you do something, in principle, I can do it too. In principle. Now, if we look at Christ at the resurrection, you find some interesting stuff that the doors are locked and he appears in the room. Right. Mm-hmm. Now, if he also has a human nature, that tells me in principle, I could do that too. It's just not unlocked, so to speak.
Peter walked on water.
Sure, yeah. And anything any human can do in principle, if it's within the human nature, I have a human nature, I can do that too. So I guess think of it like a video game where you like have to unlock, do side quests, right? So, right, it's there. Right, yeah, it's there. It's just not unlocked, and it's perhaps the case. And I think this has something to do with regeneration too. I think something happens in regeneration that it's there, but something has to be done, right? And so when we get to heaven, it makes sense to me to infer that, well, there are other capacities we have that are not unlocked, and it could be a byproduct of the fall as well. Yeah.
I'm probably missing something, but like right at the beginning of your talk, you spoke of the antagonistic professor whose job was to blow your faith out of the water.
Yeah.
And he said he could basically disprove Christianity, disprove the soul, something about resurrection. But we believe in a physical bodily
Sure.
resurrection.
Right.
And so, I mean, you know, we don't hang our hat on just like a resurrected soul.
Of course, right. Yeah, good question. So very good question. So I would say, so whether you're holomorphous, whatever form, unless you're a Christian physicalist, they're out there, you are not just a body, and you are not on earth just a soul. You are a soul with a body. But if we're just physicalist, if God were to clone me, that other body wouldn't be me, because I'm more than a body. I am also a soul. I can go a little bit deeper too if you want.
But I guess I don't understand the argument that he had.
No, so that his argument wasn't against Christianity per se; it was against the soul. What I sat and thought is that if this is true, I just put it together that if Paul says no resurrection, no Christianity.
Right.
Well, biblically speaking, a resurrection is a body and soul.
Right.
But if there's no soul and you just have a body, well, that's not a biblical resurrection. Thus, going back to Paul, Christianity can't be true.
Which,
Yeah.
which I think you mentioned, like the Christian physicalists who I guess they would have like soul sleep or something.
They're crazy. I don't know. They have all kinds of stuff,
It's
but
weird,
yeah.
you know.
How would you, let's say like to a children's Sunday school class.
Sure.
How would you describe being made in the image of God?
That we have, okay, to a child, right?
To me.
We, so if it's a child, I'm going to use, I'm oversimplifying. I say,
Yeah.
we have certain, we do things like God does. We can create, we can love.
Communicable.
We can, yeah, there you go, right. Now, I wouldn't reduce Imago Dei to function, but for those of you who are familiar with that argument, what does it mean to be in the image of God? I don't think it's just function, but I think a function points to your nature, given we're talking about capacities. So I would tell a child, you can do the kind of things you do because God can do them, and we're made in His image. And I would kind of go that route.
Yeah.
You might want to ask Hillary, though. She's a mama bear here. How would you
Yeah.
communicate that to?
I think about it a lot, yeah.
You can buy her book. It's really good.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to the thing, because I'm still trying to wrap my noodle around this. So,
You read your
if
soul.
we have gendered souls,
Yes.
why could we not say to someone, just like we see, we have intact DNA, but there can be mutations because of sin that cause things that shouldn't be that way? So how would we be able to answer someone who claims to be transgender, that
yeah.
there was some kind of sin entered and broke what was
Yeah.
supposed to be a gendered soul into the wrong gendered body? How would we be able to answer
Yeah. So,
that's not the case?
so I would say, and I think you'd agree here, that a gender or sex isn't reducible to genitalia, right? So there's other indicators of whether or not someone is a male or female. I haven't looked deeply into it, but even when in what's the word, a hermaphrodite type of, which is very rare. Is that the right word?
You might be thinking intersex. There is no
Intersex,
true
yes.
human hermaphrodite. There's no one that has functional eggs and functional sperm.
There you go. So right.
That doesn't exist, which is why they've started using intersex.
Thank you. Yeah. So that. So there are other indicators beyond genitalia that will say male or female, and I think, sure, epistemically, we don't know where to draw the line, but I would say at the end of the day. So I couldn't do a Freaky Friday body swap with you because as I understand the soul and the body, my soul made a body fit for me, so to speak. So if we were to Freaky Friday body swap, I wouldn't be able to function like I would in my body because it would be like a large size hand with a small size glove, right? There are certain things that I'd be restricted or not be able to do because I didn't create that body. When it comes to transgender, given that the soul is prior to the body, I would say that the indicators overall are going to show whether or not male or female, which is going to be based on the soul. I'd have to look deeper into that, but from what I understand it, and I don't know if you have any insight there, there are, aside from the genitalia, there are things that will point to, and I've heard it mentioned, and I forgot what it was, especially when that boxer came out, this.
The Olympics game.
Yeah, and people were pointing to certain things to where there are maybe even just a handful, but some factors that will indicate male or female, and I don't know exactly what those are.
So your point of view is that the soul is also burdened by a sinful condition, not just the physical body.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
And-
it reduces its capability, let's say.
Yeah, and I would also include that sometimes the impact of sin on the body can also inhibit the soul. So again, going back to if I had Alzheimer's or brain damage, it would reduce my ability to actualize things my soul can do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so so we know that the physical body, every generation is mutating in a detrimental way. Is there any indication that the soul of human persons is doing the same thing?
Fascinating question. Probably not the soul, but the more limitations or defects you put in the body, the more the soul's going to be limited.
Yeah.
So if I'm playing guitar and you start to detune it while I'm playing, it's going to affect the music. The song itself isn't affected, but the instrument I'm using to play the song is going to inevitably affect the music that comes out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Another question. You mentioned animals with souls. That's a shock to some people. I really didn't even hear that myself till probably 12, 15 years ago. But can you explain that a little bit? Maybe it's not as shocking to some, but
Yeah, animals totally have souls.
yeah.
They're
Next
not
question.
eternal souls.
Yeah, right. They're not by nature eternal. I think, so animals having souls, go to that. If you look in the Hebrew language, there's a word nefesh. Now that's used for soul. Granted, physicalists will argue, well, it's also used for body stuff. I don't want to get into that. I think it's synecdoche, right? Is that the word? And metonymy. Basically, it's a part of the whole relationship. If you don't know what that means, forget I said that. So in Genesis, it says that God made the land animals or land creatures. If you look in Hebrew, it says literally God made the land nefesh. Nefesh is a Hebrew word for soul. It literally says God made the land soul creatures. Everything that has a mind requires a soul to ground it. So an immaterial mind requires an immaterial substance to ground it. If my dog is conscious, it has a mind. If it has a mind, a soul must ground it. That's a quick, simple argument I'd use. So biblically, I'd point to the fact that, and then you look in the Old Testament, Balaam's donkey, God opened the donkey's mouth and it spoke. It has a mind. And that was something supernatural, and also goes into the capacity thing, which I won't get into. But if it has a mind, it needs a soul. Animals, and now how far down? I don't know. And there's also, I think, different types of souls. So how far down? I would say as analogous as they are to us, with confidence we can say they have souls. The less analogous, maybe the less confident we can be.
Yeah. So that's a degree property when it comes to animals.
I wouldn't say it's a degree of property. I would say it's a different type of soul. So not every soul is the same. So it's not like if you put my soul in a fish, I wouldn't all of a sudden become a fish soul. I would be a human soul in a fish, if that makes sense. So yeah, not every soul is different. So there are human souls, dog souls, cat souls, maybe. So it all depends on the kind of soul it is. And some souls may just not have certain types of mental attributes. Yeah.
Laura, you had a question.
Oh, yeah. So what's the difference?
Could you grab me a water bottle, please? I ran out of mine.
Soul and spirit?
Very nice, yes. So the spirit is a faculty of the soul. It's not a separate substance, thank you, of the soul. We can think of it this way. How many hands do I have?
2.
So do I have a body, a right hand and a left hand, so I have 3 bodies? No, we would say no. Those 2 hands are part of one body, right? Or I put it this way. What taste, trick question, what taste, you or your taste buds?
You.
Well, you would say me by way of my taste buds. So I would say the spirit is a faculty of the soul that is responsible for communication with God. So if you ask me what communicates, you or your spirit, I would say me via the faculty of my spirit communicate with God, just like me via my taste buds taste. So the spirit is not a separate substance. There are some people who call themselves a trichotomist, and they say there's a body, soul, and spirit. And I say, well, I believe there's a body, soul, spirit too. I just don't believe the spirit is a separate substance. Because the Bible also talks about body, soul, spirit, heart, face, stomach. So now are we like a what's the word? 5-otomy, whatever, Yeah, right? So soul and spirit can be used interchangeably. This is where I will get into metonymy or synecdoche, where basically if I say all hands on deck, I'm not asking you to chop off your hand and throw it on the deck. I am emphasizing hand because it usually indicates labor, but I'm focusing on the hand even though I want your whole body. So it could be a part to whole kind of figure of speech when it's interchangeable with spirit and soul. But yeah, I would say we are souls, and a faculty of our soul is a spirit, just like a faculty of our soul is mind. Another faculty might be a volition, things like that. So Moreland says, think of the soul like a chest of drawers. You have a sock drawer, underwear drawer, t-shirt drawer. You have one substance of soul, then you have a faculty of mind, faculty of, let's say, sensations, faculty of spirit, and these are different compartments of a single soul.
And how do you define the spirit again?
The faculty that allows or that you use to communicate with God. So I don't know if animals have spirits because I don't know if they're communicating with God. I'm not sure.
We've got time for a couple more questions.
Yeah.
So, would you say like even down to like trees and anemones, those things
Right.
have a type of soul?
Ah, I like the way you worded it, a type of soul. Right. So remember I said as long as something's analogous to us, we can say they have a soul, but the less confident. Now, I like how you worded it, type of soul. Aristotle claimed that plants do have a soul. He called it a vegetative soul. I'm fine with that. I just don't like to use the language because it's loaded. In today's culture, we think soul, we think that the ghost Casper thing that goes to heaven. But yeah, if I were sitting down with Aristotle, I'd be like, yeah, plants. He called it a life force, a principle of vitality. So do plants have that? Absolutely. Can we call it a soul? Sure. I just, in today's culture, it's hard to even get a Christian to understand what a biblical soul is. So I don't even want to touch, plant stuff.
Then would you agree that anything that does not grow does not have a soul?
Not necessarily. I would say if it's a substance, I'm pretty close to saying it has a soul. And I don't want to get into what defines a substance, but we've already seen if it's a whole prior to the parts, if the parts depend on the whole, then we're on the road to saying this is a substance here, as opposed to an aggregate.
Just real quick, it makes me think of the Bible verse that talks about the trees will clap their hands.
Yeah.
And the rocks could cry out.
Sure.
Michelle.
An aggregate is a collection of parts, and if those parts were replaced, it's no longer the same. But if you use those same parts to rebuild it, how is it not the same as the original?
Yeah, so that gets into a deep metaphysical question, and here's the short way of thinking of it. Can something begin to exist twice? I don't think so. So if something's taken apart and put back together, some philosophers would argue something came into existence or began to exist, but it couldn't have begun to exist twice. This gets into a discussion of whether or not there are... Philosophy is crazy. Whether even not there are, we could say that there is a nature of a podium nature. Philosophy is crazy because here's a meme that maybe we could... So short answer, I would say there are indications that maybe it's a different structure, you don't have it exactly the same way, and then the beginning to exist, the time frame. Like I was born on this day. I cannot be literally born in a physical sense a second time. I can be born again spiritually, but not physically. And that seems to be something similar when it comes to physical objects, putting them back together. But if someone were to say it's the same object, I wouldn't push too hard because I think the real issue becomes part replacement.
Otherwise, you get a new car. Every time you go get your car, they have to take it all apart and put it back together. It's like, it's a new car.
And I lean towards that, but it's not a deal breaker. It's not a hill I die on. I would just say if parts begin to be replaced, it's not the same object, is what I would argue. But yeah, philosophy can get really, really crazy there. Anybody know of Thomas Nagel?
Yeah.
He wrote an argument. He wrote an article called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And what's interesting, Nagel's an atheist, and basically he argues that this is a whole other argument for the soul, but basically that there's what's called first-person private access. You can know more about my brain than I do, but not more about my thoughts than I do, because there's something internal to me that you don't have access to that's more than the physical. But the meme is this. It's this freshman guy, and he's like, I just took a philosophy class. It's so cool. And then they're like, what did you learn? He's like, well, this one guy named Nagel wrote a paper called What It's Like to Be a Bat. And at the end of the paper, he concluded, we don't know. That's philosophy for you.
Chris?
So,
Yes.
when you say soul, is that kind of the same thing, or does it imply you're talking about consciousness?
Not necessarily, but yeah. So the mind is a faculty of the soul.
I have seen some biologists that are looking at the tiniest little microbacteria and say, this creature has consciousness. Even at that, what?
Sentient?
Sentience, there's sentience. That even at that small, a single cell, bacterial, has, it has activity, it's making decisions.
Yeah.
It has consciousness.
Yeah, I listened to Brian Miller's podcast on that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It was, and it's a new area of biology, and looking at the cells, because as cells divide, what's making the decision about what the next cell is?
Yeah.
And it's fascinating.
Yeah, and I haven't looked deeply into it, because some argue it's just an automaton, like a machine operating in a teleological way, given its nature. So, not. It's a little bit more than a robot. It's something biological that there's always a way to go, given certain things. I could go either way, but I will say that I do find it fascinating that we've even learned like the heart has some type of neurons. So it's more than just, so a long time ago, people would say just your brain. Now it's brain and central nervous system, because we figure that it's much deeper than just the neurons in our brain. It goes beyond that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we find other stuff that kind of pushes further the idea of where consciousness, I don't want to say resides, but what it's correlated with.
It might be more communication rather than consciousness, because I think they're finding
Yeah,
stuff within the
that's a
gut
good
that is
distinction.
communicating, but it's communicating to the consciousness, which is why they say I have a gut feeling about it. You're literally describing that there is an intuition
Right.
in your gut that it's communicating information, but you can't
Sure,
process it.
right, it's a good distinction.
Yeah.
I like that.
Final question? Anybody?
Ask now, because after this, it's $5 a question. Once we.
Well, I was just going to say one thing for people that are interested on the idea of animals and souls. Look up Hugh Ross. Hugh Ross with who's he with?
Reasons to believe, yes.
He has some really good stuff on animals and the soul, where he actually gives a pretty good theological argument for that and biblical
Oh,
examples.
very
So
nice.
just FYI.
Yeah, I'll look it up.
Sounds good.
Is that a book or what was it?
Michelle, this last question.
There's at least some YouTube videos. and
Okay,
stuff.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So I wouldn't argue you. Rephrase your question for me.
Like, our atheists have the point that they like to argue that you can have morals without God.
Oh yes, atheists will argue that, yes.
And what was the counteraction?
So, in the way I put it, like for example, the atheists I was talking to would say that you don't need God for morality, and what they typically mean is you don't need God to know morality. I agree with that. I don't think you need God to know right from wrong. I would say if there is no God, there is no objective right or wrong. But my point here was if you don't have free will, you cannot be morally accountable or morally responsible for what you do. So if imagine there's 10 cars, all parked in all in neutral. The middle car is blue. A black car comes, hits it, and then you have a chain reaction. And the blue car will eventually hit the car in front of it. Who's responsible for that damage? The what? That car that slammed into all the other ones. So if there is no God, whatever this car is a first mover, and you're just one of the cars that is a passive cog, if you will, in this chain. And you cannot be held morally responsible because something prior to you caused your actions or beliefs or etc.
Yeah, another way to talk about that is epistemology, how we know morality, what's right or wrong, versus what it's grounded in ontologically,
Yeah.
what the reality of it is. Yeah.
You'll get a copy of my book. I think it's chapter 19 where I talk about that distinction on morality.
And to Michelle's question, we're going to be talking about that on November 3rd. God's argument for God's existence, the moral argument. So we'll get a little bit deeper into that
Very nice.
at that time. So give it up again.
Thank you.
Thank you.